colleagues and friends, welcome back to another episode of the Bold by Choice podcast. This season is called Someone Has to Decide. And we chose that title pretty intentionally. We're going to be talking about governance, and governance can sometimes be misunderstood as a series of meetings, motions, policies, dashboards, or compliance. And while those pieces absolutely exist, underneath all of that is something much more human. We have to use really sound judgment. We have a lot of responsibility as board members, and it requires us to be courageous in our leadership and sometimes make really, really challenging and difficult decisions. Now, every governing board probably faces moments where the stakes become very real. A school may start to struggle academically. A leader may be under pressure or decide to change. A budget may no longer work for the system. A renewal decision may be pending. A difficult conversation everyone hoped could wait is now urgent. And in those moments, governance is no longer theoretical because someone ultimately has to decide. So today, Jim and I are going to have a conversation that really explores the moral weight of governance decisions and why stewardship sometimes requires choices that are uncomfortable or unpopular, even emotionally difficult. So, Jim, let's buckle in. You ready to get started?
Hey, I am. Board governance is stewardship of the charter promise.
That's right. And we owe it to our kiddos and the community to do this well.
That's
So,
why we're bold.
it requires us to be bold. Well, I'm going to start with a story that kind of has come out of some of the things we've seen. And so here's the concept. There's a board conversation where everyone kind of entered the meeting, and you could almost see it on the faces and the body language. The kind of emotional exhaustion had set in. This school was made up of incredibly wonderful, passionate families, really dedicated educators and teachers, and the founding team was nothing short of committed. But the academic outcomes had really started to slip, and they had remained a little bit weak for years, despite repeated interventions and efforts to add support to the school leadership team and the school itself. And the hardest part was that everyone in the room cared so deeply about the school and for its success and its mission. There was not a single person there that was indifferent. Nobody lacked compassion. And that's what I think made the decision so painful. So let's unpack that kind of story together, Jim. No, one of the things that kind of stood out to me is sometimes when people talk about when boards start to struggle or when governance starts to seem like it's really hard, it happens because someone on the team or some person is malicious. And I don't think that's true at all. I think in our experience, we've seen nothing but the best intended folks. But sometimes things really do happen, and we have to look at our academics and we have to make tough decisions.
Vashaunta, you're right. And, you described it as they came into the meeting exhausted, right? That's probably not physical exhaustion. It's probably mental exhaustion, right? And
Mm-hmm.
why? Because they're facing a decision that's just hard. And you think about it in our own lives, what are the most difficult decisions we make? They usually center around family and people we love and care about.
Mm-hmm.
How do you convey the decision? Is that the right decision? How do you know? When do you do it? Those are the challenges of boards, right? And it's those times that try your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do boards make those decisions? Well, if they were working with the Institute, we'd say this is when you pull out your values,
Yeah.
is you got a storm raging around you and you need your lighthouse. You need your values to help guide your decisions.
That's
Um, but the reality is, we all face those trials. And it's in those trials where, we tell you to be bold by choice. Well, what does that mean? Does not mean be reckless, does not mean be hurried, it does not mean be careless. What it means is you've got to step up, right? Accept the challenge. If you're the board, you've got the role of being a decider.
mm-hmm.
Well, you got to stay true. What do you stay true to? Your values, your commitments, your promises, your word, your contracts, right? You got to stay true. But we really mean in the bold by choice that stay true is when the going gets tough, you stay true to your convictions, to your values, to your promises, to your word, right? And then you got to prove the promise together. And proving the promise means you're delivering results. And so in this story, if you're not delivering the academic results, is that failure? Or is that you had an idea, you tried it, you gave it your best, it didn't work? And the good news is you showed the way of one thing that's not going to work so somebody can pick up something
Mhm.
else.
Yeah.
The question is, when it's not working, is it correctable or is it better to exit out gracefully?
And how strong do you take in a corrective action? Like I could imagine this board grappling with, let's say it's been 5 to 8 years and likely a renewal is coming up. Well, if academics have declined during that time, things I think board members or even myself as a board member start to ask, do we need to consider new leadership? Do we need to consider some sort of staffing change, like a major one? Because it says in the story that some interventions have taken place and they just haven't been robust enough. Do we take on an even more robust approach, almost like turnaround? And I think when you start as a board member putting those questions on the table, like it gets tough, right? Like you can almost see everyone take that breath and kind of lean back because those are really major decisions. And I love that you said this, and you always tell us this to start with our values. If our value is students first and we committed to a high quality academic program, like we're going to have to make one of those tough decisions if we're ever going to meet that promise to students.
Vashaunta, it takes me back to my time with Central Michigan University. And we chartered 50 plus schools. They serve 35,000 students across the state of Michigan, urban, rural, suburban, right? Broad mix. When faced with these, I kind of broke it down to two things. Number one, do you have the will? Because if you don't have the will, there's really not much to talk about, right? But if you do have the will, the next question is, do you have the capacity?
Mm-hmm.
And the capacity is usually where most of the time gets spent, right? Well, how much time and capacity and resources will it take? And is it worth it? Right? Um, sometimes you have a hand of cards and you just can't win the game with that hand of cards, right? So we used to talk about school closures and school closure, how do you handle that? Right? Because when the whole thing closes, it's cataclysmic,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like an organism dying. And that impacts students, it impacts families, it impacts teachers, it impacts bus drivers, right? It impacts
Mm-hmm.
bondholders, it impacts the whole organism. So one of the ways is if there's something bad going on, is it isolated to a person or two,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can extract a person or two, or is the organization itself so far gone it's not recoverable? Right.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to give a framework of how to think about it. Do you have the will? If you got the will, do you have the capacity? If you don't have the capacity, what would it take to get it? Can you build it? Can you buy it? How long will it take? Um, the one thing that I've been using lately is watching Indiana win the national championship in football, right? Historically, not a football program, right? You might think basketball. But what the coach came in and they did something historic, right? They went undefeated and they won the national championship in 1 year. And what he said is when you take over a losing program, the first thing you have to do is change the mindset. And then you've got to get people to believe, and then anything's possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about boards that face these really difficult decisions, right? What is the issue? And I don't mean the symptom. What's the issue? And when you get down to the core issue with schools, it usually has to do with people.
Mm-hmm.
and money,
That's
right? And those are hard things to deal with. But you get down to the core issue. Well, then what's the mindset that has to be changed?
right.
What do you actually believe in? We would call that your purpose, your North Star, your why. And then how do you get people to believe that change is possible, that change is good? Because what you need to do is change. You need to change quickly. You need to get better quickly, right? To stay in business. And in order to do that, you've got to have people bought into that.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they're resisting it and you're in a power struggle, you don't have time for that, right? So, you'd call it all hands on deck. Well, what's a board's role in that? That's helping create the shared vision. Where do we want to go? The shared values. How are we going to judge our behaviors and our decisions and our actions? And then it's plans to put those things in place.
Yeah,
And the boards need to help be part of that solution, but they're not the ones that implement the plans.
that's right.
Now, the challenge every board faces is when the plan's not working, is it's because it was a bad plan, or was it poorly implemented, or did we not have the right people, right? So in the classroom, we'd call it, did we have fidelity of implementation? With a charter, was the charter a bad idea, or was it implemented wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Or wasn't implemented with fidelity? But I think those are the things that you got to wrestle through. And what does that ultimately require? It requires professional judgment. Like there are a lot of tools and resources and supports for that, but ultimately it comes down to professional judgment. And that's why we have boards to be diverse, to deliberate, to bring multiple perspectives. But ultimately, then the vote's got to be called and they got to decide. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how we say a board speaks with one voice is through their votes. And that's when you're called to step up and
And
stay
be
true
bold.
and
Yeah.
cast your vote.
That's true. You brought out so many points there that I want to kind of like touch on a little bit. And one is, you kind of mapped it out for us. What's the framework for which you think? And in that, what are the questions to ask yourselves as a board and to ask that school leader? And then being open to all of the information that will come back as answers. That information can come back through anecdotes from parents, from students, from teachers, from school leaders. It can come back through your data. You can do a deeper analysis. I love when I was a teacher, the big thing to do was have data driven instruction, right? And so we all were trained in that. So, how do boards get a little bit more of a deep dive on what the data is telling, especially if we're talking academic performance here? And you're saying, well, that might be the symptom. That decline in reading or math scores or both may actually be a symptom. How do we dig further to figure out what may be causing that? What's that item level analysis? What is that subject level analysis? How do you go to grade level, right? What are all the things to analyze? And for me as a board member, that makes me more comfortable to arrive at a decision and to be able to vote on whichever way I feel about the decision that we're going to come up with. And so I can't underscore, I have to bring up the power of curious listening. I think we have to listen as board members and read. I'm going to put reading and listening together there. And taking in as much information and as much detail as possible to help us come to a place where we can make that hard decision and do it really well.
Vashaunta, what you said is so important. And so, for all the board members out there listening, I'm going to try and say it in a way that's memorable. But, right, if we go to Covey's 7 habits, one of the habits is seek to understand before being understood. And a lot of times, when the board shows up in this meeting and it's tense and they're exhausted, they want to demand and they want to tell. There's a time where a board needs to vote and set expectations, right? But there's a
Mm-hmm.
time where the board needs to listen, observe, and I think what you said is truly here. Right? And that's part of doing your homework, right? It's part of being objective. It's part of being thoughtful. And one of the things that leads to is what we'd call ask wise questions. Because sometimes you're told stuff from an angle, from a view, from a perspective. It's not the full view and the full perspective. And part of the role of the board is to be keepers of the vision, right? Keepers of the promise, keepers of the charter. And that's not just short term, that's long term.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the vision, the mission, and the values are such critical foundational work to it. the other part of the board is, I mean, just say this to boards. If you're listening to this, there's two things that ought to set your red flags off. If your leader says, just trust me,
Oh,
right? That's that should set off a red flag, particularly when it is, don't you trust me, right? More on that in a future episode. The second one is just tell me what to do,
mm-hmm.
right? Great leaders, I use Collins as level 5 leader. Great leaders are personally humble, professionally willed. And what that means is they know how to put the cause, the organization, the mission ahead of themselves, and they know how to lead. If you don't have somebody like that, the question is, do you have a manager or a leader? Because in trying times, you need leaders. It's hard to manage yourself out of a crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a key thing for boards to discern. If you end up asking the question and you come to the conclusion, we have a manager, the question is, can your manager develop the skills? Can you supplement those skills? Can you surround them with the skills to get you through this time and develop their ability?
Mm-hmm.
But when you're in a real troubled situation, you need somebody to lead you out of it, not manage you through it. And I think that's what I really want to convey to boards is that's like you've got to get down to that issue. Do you have the leadership team in place to move you through this, to learn from it, and make sure it doesn't happen again?
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to caution against is not allowing the excuses to take over. Now, in doing that root cause analysis, you're going to come to understand a lot of things. They cannot be turned into excuses. They are just information, they're data points. And I think what can sometimes happen is, let's be real, these are folks we know. We may even spend time with outside of school hours. And so there's human connection there, which makes some of these decisions really difficult. And so I always want to caution boards when you're in that board role, making sure that you're on that balcony seat, taking in all the data and the information, not allowing it to turn into excuses, but allowing it to inform what needs to happen next. And that's the slippery slope I have witnessed some boards have. It's like, oh, there's all these reasons, right? I learned all of this stuff when I started digging in. And it's like, yes, but the reason we're learning it is so that we can write the course because we've got to get to results, not because we're going to make excuses for why the current state is the current state, right? Like our role is to adjust that state.
Our team's the promise keepers, not the excuses,
Yeah, that's right.
right? So, but there's a really important point there for boards. Don't make it personable. Don't make it personal, right? Make it about the mission, about the organization, about the commitments, about living the values, right? About outcomes for kids.
That's right.
The professionals would call it third point data. But the point being is you're keeping your eye on the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as a board, you're the promise holder and keeper, the steward of that charter contract, of that charter promise. If you keep the focus on that and how well are we delivering on our promises, you're going to be on solid ground.
I completely agree. I completely agree. Well, why don't we move to pulling a bold by choice card for this? Look at that box. I love it.
I love these cards and I love the stories coming in from around the country, how people are putting them to use in their own organizations. That's exactly what we hoped for.
It does make us smile every time we get a text or email or call. It makes us smile. So you guys keep them coming.
All right, Vashaunta, here's the card. What difficult conversation might your board be avoiding right now?
Oh, that's a good one.
Not someday, right now.
Right now.
I love avoiding difficult conversations. People don't like conflict. And when you volunteer your
It's
time
true.
to serve on a board, if you can avoid conflict and difficult conversations, you tend to do it.
You
But that's
do.
not what stewards of possibility and guardians of opportunity do. They
No, it's not.
confront with dignity, with tact, but they don't avoid the things that are going to make us better for kids.
That's right. That's right. And I'll be vulnerable. My board fellow board members know I'm super vulnerable on this show. And I don't know if we're avoiding, but what we need to get to, we have a conversation we need to have. We have not quite mapped out what the process is going to look like for us evaluating our leader. And so, with it being summer before us opening our very first school in the state, that is something we will be talking about here very shortly. So, I will offer that one. That's one that's top of mind for us.
Evaluating your leader is one of the core things boards need to do, and we recommend it on an annual cycle. But I'll take it beyond the, human resources side of why annual performance evaluations matter. Boards need to set expectations. In the conversation with the leader about what they expect from the board, what the board should expect from them, what the students and families should expect from the school, what the people that work out of this at the school should expect from the organization they work for. That conversation around those expectations is so powerful, and it's bigger than what can be reduced to what I call SMART goals. So
Mhm.
when you actually do the annual performance evaluation from an HR standpoint, a lot of those things get reduced to SMART goals because they're measurable and they're time bound and all of those things. But the conversation about expectations is critical.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Because what's the old adage, Jim? What's inspected gets done, or something to that tune. So I think that's a good reminder for us that serve on boards. Our expectations being very clear, clear as kind, communicated, transparent, but also that aligned to that standard that we've written in our charter helps signal to the school leader and therefore down to the school where we're headed.
Yeah. And the thing about boards and school leaders is they have to work together to have a successful organization. And so one of the questions or conversations around expectations is how do we best work together?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times they've never had that conversation, right? And so there's the assumptions of what the leader does and what the board does. But it's a worthwhile conversation to say, how do we best work together to advance the mission and keep the promise of the school?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if that feels scary out there, feel free, ladies and gentlemen, to start thinking about ways to introduce that conversation in your committee meetings. I think that sometimes helps those conversations get started in a lower stakes environment.
And Vashant, I want all the listeners to listen to this. Governance and leadership are often compared, contrasted. And I want you to hear something different today. There's the role of the board and how a board makes formal decisions at a board meeting. And there's things that people that lead the school, manage the school, administer to the school do. They're different roles, but they both involve leadership. And so, what I want people to hear is that boards and school leaders both have a joint responsibility to provide leadership. And when they're talking about those expectations, they're aligning goals, they're aligning expectations. That's joint leadership in a really constructive way that doesn't mix up the role of the board and the role of the school leadership. What it says is we've got a shared responsibility to keep the promise of this charter.
Beautifully said. Well, that's a great segue to our boardroom moment. So, listeners, here's this week's boardroom moment. At your next board meeting, ask yourselves, where might we be protecting comfort instead of confronting reality? And what difficult question needs more courage, honesty, or curiosity at our table right now? We know governance is not simply overseeing organizations. It is, as Jim says all the time, stewarding promises made to families, made to students, and made to communities. And I want to just say this last piece. Sometimes saying yes to excellence requires saying no to a few other things. So think about that as you and your boards grapple with whatever is top of mind this month. Any closing reflections, Jim?
Strong governance is not just measured by your moments of success. It's measured by whether boards are willing to make difficult decisions, make those decisions with integrity, class, professionalism, but also being bold, making the decisions, stepping up, being the deciders, casting the vote when the stakes are highest, when all the eyes are on you, when it's highly emotional. Because stewardship isn't passive. It requires judgment, it requires discretion, it requires wisdom, but ultimately it requires somebody to decide. And there's certain times that the board is the decider. They're the ones with the authority to cast a vote, make a decision, speak within one voice, and set the direction for the organization. And that's not always fun, but it is critical. And that's why we do this work. We want boards to be fully informed, supported, and equipped so that when the going gets tough, they're the ones that can step up with clear eyes, eye on the North Star, make the right decision for kids and for taxpayers.
Absolutely. Well, listeners and board members out there, thank you for joining us for this episode and also this season of the Bold by Choice podcast. If today's conversation resonated with you, don't hesitate. If you haven't done so already, click that subscribe button. The beautiful thing about this season is we'll be bringing on our colleagues from the National Charter Schools Institute, and we all work with and train boards all over the country. And we'll be continuing to unpack some of the tensions and conversations and advice that we've learned along the way, because we know the promise doesn't prove itself and someone has to decide. Well, until next week, stay bold.